Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joe Robbins, and I'm the Program Manager for Disabilities Inclusion here at the URJ. And we are happy to have you here with us for the second webinar in the URJ-Ruderman High Holidays Inclusion Learning Series. This webinar is High Holidays and Families with Disabilities, Make It or Break It. And we are grateful to have Meredith Polsky of Matan here. I will let her introduce herself and tell you more about herself. And basically, Meredith is going to give us a wonderful presentation, and then we'll jump right into a Q&A session. We're thrilled to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to Meredith now.
Thanks so much, Joe, and thank you, URJ, for inviting Matan to participate in this really interesting and really important webinar series. Like Joe said, my name is Meredith Polsky. I'm the National Director of Institutes and Training at Matan, which is a national not-for-profit organization based in New York City. I'm actually based just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. I see a couple of familiar names on the participant list, so welcome to everybody. I founded Matan about 16 years ago, recognizing a need in the Jewish community to help Jewish education and Jewish institutions in general be more welcoming and accommodating of children with special needs and their families. And I know that it's become much more of a hot topic in recent years, which has been really gratifying to see. Matan works all over the country with communities who are really looking to step up their inclusion efforts. A lot of people really want to do right by inclusion and just don't necessarily know how, but the fact that people are willing to ask the questions is really, really important and great to see. We also run a Matan Institute for different cohorts of educators, from education directors to early childhood educators and lots of different Jewish professionals and leaders in the field, helping them to create their own environments that are more inclusive of kids with special needs. So you can certainly reach out to me afterwards about any of that. As for this webinar, this is a really exciting topic because the high holidays can feel so overwhelming just in general, and all the more so, I think, for individuals with special needs or families who have children with special needs or disabilities. So I'm really glad that this topic sort of rose to the top of what the URJ wanted to accomplish in their webinars. We called it Make It or Break It because there will be most likely lots of families who are not already involved in your synagogue or who are not already involved in your temple's preschool or religious school, and they may really be coming to see how you respond to them and how their family feels as part of your community. And so even if children maybe had been turned away from the preschool or the religious school, or maybe they gave it a shot but you just weren't there yet in terms of your ability to include that child, this is an opportunity to really show families how far you've come, how much this has become a real priority in your community. But by the same token, if we're not proactive and we don't plan for families with different needs and different abilities, then the opposite can happen. They can really walk away saying, well, that's not a place for me. I'm not going to be able to pursue that as part of my community. So there's the make it or break it part. And I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint presentation so that you can follow along. There are not too many words on it, some words, some images, in the hopes that it'll help you remember what we talked about and give you some tips and clues as we move forward. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I tried to turn everything off on my computer, but I apologize if anything pops up, some random message or something. So hi holidays and families with disabilities, make it or break it. Of course, that's what we're going to be talking about today. I told you a little bit about Matan. My background is in clinical social work, special education, and early intervention. As you can see, Matan's mission is to educate Jewish leaders, educators, and communities. And our goal is really to empower others, not to outsource inclusion, which is sort of an oxymoron, but to really empower leaders to make their organizations throughout North America as inclusive as possible, and giving them and you the tools that you need in order to do so. So just to give you a sense of why this topic is so important, we know that 15 to 20% of children and youth ages 3 to 21 have a diagnosed learning disability. 1 in 68 children in the U.S. has an autism spectrum disorder. And there are about 200,000 students in the Jewish community with special needs. And we get that because there are about 1 million Jewish kids in the United States, and so we take national averages and figure there are about 200,000 kids in the Jewish community who either are part of our communities right now or who have not yet found a way into our communities because of their special needs. So we want to talk about really creating a community of inclusion in our synagogue, especially around the high holidays. And I want to make note of the fact that the ideas and strategies that we're going to talk about today that help create an inclusive community benefit everyone, not just individuals with special needs and disabilities. And I have a feeling, I hope that as we go forward and as we talk about different ideas, you're going to say, oh, you know what, that would work really well for my kid who doesn't have a disability, or that would work really well for, you know, my friend who doesn't have a disability, but, you know, really would benefit from this. And of course, I think you're going to find that this is not just applicable to high holidays, but to synagogue and temple events in general. So I know that those of you who chose to be on this webinar, you're a little bit of a self-selecting crowd. So I know that you have an understanding of what inclusion is. But just so that we're all on the same page and sort of starting from the same point, I'd like to define inclusion as an attitude, right? It's really not a program. Inclusion is an attitude and approach that ensures every person, regardless of ability or background, can meaningfully participate in all aspects of life. And one of the things I really like about the whole idea of this webinar is that it's very proactive. You're going to think about ideas that you can implement before the high holidays take place so that you're not putting out fires during those days and you're not sort of backing up plans in order to be inclusive. You're actually taking inclusivity into account from the start. So these are other ways that we like to think about inclusion at Matan. Offering the same opportunities for people with and without disabilities, welcoming everyone, emphasizing cooperation, looking to understand and accommodate differences, having facilities and areas that are accessible and easy to use by everyone, providing a safe and socially comfortable environment for all, teaching respect, understanding, and dignity to people of all abilities, embracing changes that facilitate full participation, fostering a sense of belonging to community as a respected and valued peer, and really honoring the intrinsic value of each person's life. I know I said there weren't going to be a lot of words on the slide. I think after this there are not a lot of words. But just so that we can really all, you know, again, start from the same point of understanding. And I think a lot of these sort of core principles you're going to see throughout everything else that we talk about today. So this is another way of looking at it, right? And on the first circle, we see really what exclusion looks like, right? So we're talking about special needs programs versus inclusion. So exclusion is when you don't give any thought to people with varying abilities or special needs and disabilities. And they're really around that outer circle, right? They're sort of outside of the community, looking in, maybe wanting to be part of things, but at the moment not being able to. The second one is integration, and this is what a special needs program might look like: a class for children with special needs, a separate children's service during the high holidays or any other time for individuals with special needs, sensory Shabbat perhaps, and it's not a bad thing. It's not a judgment in any way, but that's what it looks like. You have your whole community, and you have individuals with special needs in the middle of that community, but sort of doing their own thing. And then you have the last circle, which is inclusion, which is really everybody as part and parcel of everything that goes on within the synagogue community. And that's what we're going to talk about in terms of ideas for the high holidays. So I've broken this down into a few different components. And just so you know what's coming, we're going to talk about the main sanctuary. We're going to talk about children's services, communication, and a couple of other things that sort of fall into those categories. So the first thing I want to talk about is really the role of the clergy. And I don't know how many rabbis or cantors are on this webinar right now, or how many of you sort of have the ear of your rabbi or cantor in order to provide suggestions following the webinar. But we find at Matan that it's really, really crucial for the rabbi to be able to communicate verbally or in writing, or preferably both, that these are the values of the synagogue when it comes to inclusion. So by that I mean he or she might want to write about it in the bulletin. He might or she might want to explicitly state it from the bima, from the pulpit. It can bring about tremendous bridge building, and it can really open lines of communications. A lot of what we see is that people simply don't know that your congregation is looking to be inclusive because it's not communicated in any clear way. And we're going to talk more about communication, but specifically in terms of the clergy, the more that they can talk about it from the pulpit, from the bima, the more it's going to be ingrained in people's minds that this is actually a really important value of the temple as a whole, of the congregation as a whole. It starts to become something that's really cultural about the synagogue, and it becomes something that people really want to be a part of. Cantors really need to be aware also about the degree to which you want to welcome individuals with special needs into the high holiday services. So it might be that the cantor decides he or she is going to give certain warning signs. If something's about to get really loud, or everybody's about to do something that might be, startling to somebody with different sensory needs. Whatever the case may be, maybe they have little signs, maybe they actually say it out loud, maybe they give something out to children or other congregants to help engage them in the music, whether it's a quiet instrument or something they do, with hand movements or something like that, to really figure out how to best engage the congregants, particularly families of kids with special needs, so that they don't feel like they're being disruptive or asked to always conform to what's going on in the high holiday service, but that things are really taking them into account as well. And of course, we know that the high holidays are, very, they follow a specific script, and there are so many people, and we can't cater to every single individual, but there are things that the rabbi and the cantor can do from the bima in front of everybody that would really go a tremendous way in helping people understand, again, that inclusion is a living, breathing value of that congregation. The role of the congregants, I think, is probably the most important thing that we encounter, but it really comes from the top. It really comes from the rabbi, the cantor, the board, any leader who's going to be speaking in front of the congregation or to the congregation, whether in writing or at the actual service. It really comes down to the messages that they're giving and the degree to which they're talking about inclusion in their messages. And so the role of the congregants becomes one of acceptance, right? And we all have people at our congregations who maybe are used to things in a certain way and certain things associated with young families or families of kids with special needs or adults with special needs might be out of the norm, right? Things might happen that they're not necessarily expecting. And I sort of think of that as a special need also, as strange as it might sound. These are people who, are really used to their routine and really want things to go a certain way. And so how can we help them also understand that when we are welcoming of all different kinds of people, we are allowing things to happen that might be out of the norm? And how do we prepare them for that as well? And again, I think it really comes down to this idea of communication. What are the values that the rabbi and cantor are espousing from the bima, from the pulpit, and what are some simple things that they can do in their role in order to model that type of inclusion? I'm going to X out of this for 1 second. I think I remember how to do that, so that I can give you an example. So you might be thinking, well, I'm sure that my rabbi would be willing to talk about inclusion from the bima, from the pulpit, but I'm really not sure that they have a sense of what they would want to say during that time. So I just want to mention that Matan has started, well, actually a while ago, about a year ago, we started a Devar Torah project where if you haven't seen it, every week we post on our blog a Devar Torah, a word of Torah written by rabbis from across denominations from across the United States, linking that week's Torah portion to a message of inclusion. So rabbis who never really thought about inclusion, or at least not in this way before, are suddenly writing really, really profound divrei Torah, words of Torah, about inclusion for that particular Torah portion or that week's parsha. We've gone through a full year's cycle of this already. So any parsha that your rabbi might be speaking about on the high holiday, I know they would all be the same, but whether on the high holidays or any week, if you find that your rabbi could use some suggestions of talking about inclusion from the bima, or linking a specific Torah portion to inclusion, please let them know that this is a free resource on Matan's blog, which is on our website, and that they can read through the divrei Torah. If they'd like to become a contributor, we would welcome them to become a contributor. But if they're having trouble getting started and thinking about the messages and thinking about how to share with the congregation what this value of inclusion is, I really encourage them to take a look and see sort of what strikes them as really relevant to them and your communities to share as well. And the one up here that you see on the screen is just one example from a whole year of this project, and the project is ongoing, so we've started a year too. So children's programming, and this may be what a lot of you have on your mind in terms of planning for the high holidays. And I think the most important thing is to really think proactively about your children's programming. I know, at lots of synagogues that I've been to, kids with special needs might show up for children's programming, and somebody there might have some ideas of how to accommodate them and how to help them be successful, but it's almost always after the fact. And so what I'd really like to encourage you is, now that we know that 15 to 20% of the population of children have some sort of learning disability or special need, let's just go ahead and plan for it and assume that they're going to show up at our services. And let the families be really pleasantly surprised about how much you've done in order to accommodate all learners. So the first tip I would say is to provide visual schedules, and those of you who teach in religious school or preschool or at camp or wherever else are probably familiar with visual schedules, but I've never seen one in a high holiday children's program. And sometimes, you might think, oh, well, we just do the service and that's it. But even within the service, there are definitely components of the service that you can list in a visual way. I know a lot of children's services also take a break for snacks. Some temples or synagogues have a whole morning of activities where it's partly the service, partly snack, partly they go to the gym and play games. Maybe they go outside to the playground. These are a lot of things for kids, for any kids really, but kids who struggle with any kind of learning disability or special need to sort of stay on top of. It's a lot of transitions. It only comes once a year, these high holidays. So they really can't rely on their memory of the routine from last year. And so establishing that routine and really helping them to understand the routine and being able to check back on the visual schedule, I think you'll find makes a tremendous difference for so many kids, and really limits the chaos that can often be found in children's programming. In an ideal world, I would say maybe you have registration for your children's services, and maybe parents are able to share with you any special need that their child may have, and you can even provide a visual schedule in advance of the services in a few weeks, and we'll talk a little bit more about ideas for that too. Also for children's programming, have your leaders really keep in mind different modes of learning. It's a very rare kid, I think it's a very rare person, I'm not one of them, who can really just sit for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, and really be fine with that, whether they're taking in information or not, but at least look like they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. We really want to emphasize thinking about how people learn, whether it's through kinesthetic, right, movement or tactile experiences, auditory or visual. Really have your leaders think about those different modes of learning, so that you might be having a discussion during the children's service, and instead of just having kids raise their hand or shout out answers, maybe you can play here or there, where they go to one end of the room to express one answer, the other end of the room to express another answer, and maybe somewhere in the middle if it's a continuum kind of question. There are lots of ways to incorporate games and different movements and tactile experiences into high holiday services. And I want to show you a couple of them that are on the Matan website that also you can download and print and do with what you want. Let me just switch over to it here. So these are on the Matan website. There's a shofar game. There's a shofar blast song. There's visuals for dipping the apple in the honey, and also the apple and honey blessing. And we'll be putting up more resources as well. But you can see that they really all take into account different modes of learning, whether it's providing, the visual for the bracha or for the dipping apples into honey and singing. The shofar game allows them to really run around and really take in the different sounds of the shofar and what makes them different. So there are lots of ways, again, to incorporate different modes of learning, and I just think that should be really part and parcel of the planning of the high holiday children's leaders. If you're looking for more ideas, you can certainly reach out to me. You can certainly continue to check Matan's website. There's things you can do with almost every single aspect of the service. Whether you're talking about things that children may have done, wrong during the year that they want to say they're sorry for. I've done Simon Says with kids where, put your hands on your head if you ever, took a toy from your brother or sister, or, things like that. Jump up and down if, whatever else. Just to really, get people moving. And that can work for, lots of different age groups. Obviously, you'll want to adapt it to different ages. And for older kids, think about what they can do talking to each other about, a certain topic and maybe sharing back to the group, or moving around the room to express different ideas of either agreeing or disagreeing. And just think about those things that can be tactile, kinesthetic, auditory, or visual. And you'll find that the kids are much more engaged because you're really catering to all the different ways in which they learn. Fidgets. So I think I forgot to mention this during the part about the main sanctuary, but I actually think that the main sanctuary should have a couple of different baskets or bins of fidgets for anybody in the congregation to be able to partake in. I think the fact that they're there should be announced from the BEMA. Again, it's good modeling in terms of letting the congregation know that this is a core value. For anybody who doesn't know, fidgets are just things you can get at the dollar store very easily, a stress ball, a tangle toy, anything like that. I think I have a picture on the next slide somewhere. Quiet books, magnet toys, different things that would help somebody who either needs a break or really pays better attention when they have something to do with their hands. You know, if you think about board meetings you've been to where somebody's knitting, that's what's going on. They concentrate better, they focus better, they take in information better when they're doing something with their hands. So in every children's programming room, I would love to see a basket of fidgets. I know you're going to be worried about children throwing the fidgets and playing with them inappropriately. Usually what we find is that when we're very open about our goals and our desire to take into account how everybody learns, kids then know that, and then they can be respectful of the process. I do think it should be sort of, you know, part of your like opening announcements in children's programming that we are an inclusive community. We want everybody to feel successful here. Here are a couple of ways that we're going to make sure that can happen, and fidgets is one of those ways. So you might want to let them know, you know, first rule is no flying fidgets, right? Any fidgets that are played with inappropriately, quietly, you go and you just take it away. Generally, this works really, really well. Kids understand probably better than most adults. Kids with special needs, they're together in school. The language is becoming more common in terms of, you know, making accommodations and modifications, and just letting them know that different kids need different things in order to be successful, and that's what our day together is going to be all about. Parent communication. So it's really, really important for parents to know what to expect. You know, people often say that, you know, parents with anxiety have kids with anxiety, but the opposite is also true. Kids with anxiety or special needs have parents who may be more anxious. And, you know, obviously not just talking about anxiety, but for a parent to leave a child in a children's program that is not part of their normal routine is really, really difficult. So the more that you can communicate to parents, either ideally in advance of the high holidays, or at least when they come to bring their child to the room, let them know what the expectations are. Let them know how you've structured things so that, you know, it can be successful for every child. And almost more importantly, let them know what you're going to do if there's a problem. How are you going to find them? At what point are you going to look for them? What does a problem constitute? Is it just a behavior issue, or do you feel pretty well prepared for behavior issues, but there may be some other kind of issue? Again, these are things that temples and synagogues and children's programming leaders don't tend to think through. But the more you become inclusive and the more that you attract families of kids with special needs, which is really our goal, the more you want to plan proactively about these things and really think about what are your procedures and protocols. What can the parents expect? It's really important for parents to feel comfortable with the plan, know what the plan is, Think about, for what they can expect, also how you're conveying that. This is going to help reduce anxiety for all kids and families, not just kids with special needs. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is an idea I really like for any synagogue space, whether you're, renting out a high school for the high holidays, or you're in your regular building, or you're on various floors throughout your building. If you can designate a quiet space as a sensory room or a break room, this can be a really wonderful place for people, children, but also anybody to go when they're feeling really overwhelmed by the high holiday experience. It would be a quiet room with dim lighting. There may be quiet sensory toys, and there would be fluidity, meaning that people can come and go. I know that there are concerns about, how this would be staffed, if you would get parent volunteers. Obviously, you don't want, just rambunctious kids running in and out as an extra place to play. But really thinking about it and putting a sign on the door of what it's for, being really welcoming and letting people know, what it's for and why it's there, and really conveying that in advance of the high holidays as well, so that parents know to sort of prepare their kids about that as well. I've heard of different temples, different synagogues sort of staffing the room in some way during a service or a high holiday. I don't know that that's possible for everybody, but maybe you can have parent rotations or something of the sort in order to maintain sort of the point of the sensory room or the break room, which is that, people can come and go, but it doesn't get wild. And again, you would have quiet sensory toys, books, things like that. Here you see in the picture, that's actually like a little swing. Obviously, you wouldn't do that, but you can have a couple of beanbag chairs, a couple pillows, if you have weighted blankets or something like that already in your nursery school or religious school, you can put those in there for the duration of the holidays and invite people to come in and take a break. So training is really important in terms of if you're still evolving, which I think most of us are, in terms of what you're providing on the high holidays and what level of inclusion you're providing. It's really important that every staff member who's going to be in the building understands what that process is. So from leaders of children's services to, ushers who may be taking tickets, to really anybody on your staff or your board or lay leaders who are going to be involved in a leadership role in the high holidays. You need to make it clear to them what your expectations are and what your protocols are in terms of inclusion, right? Because it may be very clear to you that, you're not going to, reprimand a particular child who's exhibiting certain needs, but the ushers know that it's their job to maintain decorum, let's say. And so we really need to close that loop in terms of expectations and protocols. We want to do this in a really proactive way. Again, not just catching people as they come in for high holidays, but maybe holding a conference call or holding a meeting of everybody on the synagogue staff, from the rabbi to the custodial staff to anybody else who might be involved in that. Excuse me. So in terms of also what are the protocols? So what happens if a children's service leader does need support of some kind? Or what happens if a parent in the building is finding that their child is really overwhelmed, or an individual themselves is, becoming overwhelmed or confused or whatever it may be in the service? What's the procedure? Who can they go to? Who can they talk to? Again, just think really proactively in terms of what you envision for your particular temple or synagogue. If it's that you're going to have fidget baskets in the sanctuary for the first time, who's going to explain that? What's the sign going to be next to it? What are your expectations for how those things are going to be used? And also in terms of personnel, who's around the building, who can help, who can people go to with a problem. So another thing that I really recommend in terms of being proactive are social stories. Social stories are really great tools that children can use to really understand what's coming, what's going to be happening. It really helps them internalize the process. I'm going to show you an example of one that we created for, it's actually for B'nai Mitzvah. It's like a bar and bat mitzvah guide, but can be pretty easily adapted for high holidays as well. So you can see this is a B'nai Mitzvah guide, and it shows, you know, what should kids know before they come for high holidays, right? Again, this is only a once a year kind of thing. It's not part of their regular routine. They may or may not come to synagogue regularly, and we want them to have an understanding of what it means to come to synagogue, right? So we have something about behavior, something about how they should dress, something about talit and kippot, and things like that. So again, like very simple language, some simple pictures. We have ideas about who may participate in the service. And then we also have various, and it won't go through all of them, but various visuals for different prayers that also can be utilized in the children's services. So when we think about different ways of doing things and different modes of learning, we want to think about, you know, to what extent are things transliterated, to what extent are things in English, and to what extent are pictures provided to help people and to help kids understand, you know, what's going on at that point in the service. Going back to the PowerPoint, so we're going to move on to say that communication is really key. So sometimes I think that the inclusion efforts of a particular temple or synagogue are actually like the best kept secret in the community. Because you might know that, you know, you have a heart of gold, the rabbi has a heart of gold, you will do anything in your power to make sure that the high holiday services and the temple in general is inclusive. But how do people know that, right? You want to get people in who aren't necessarily already in, and you really need to think about how you're making that known. So communication is really key. What are you putting on your website when you put up all your information about the high holidays? What are you putting in high holiday materials? You know, I got a postcard today from my synagogue about it being, you know, time to think about the high holidays, time to buy tickets, things like that. But what I want to see is something on the bottom that says, you know, we're an inclusive community. If we can do anything to make the experience positive and successful for you or your child, please contact this person at this number or this email address. I want to know really clearly that this is a community that I can really depend on for being inclusive and for really understanding the needs of me and my family. So I actually think this is just one of the most important things, because once you start putting that out there, people are going to take notice of it, because so many synagogues and temples don't put that out there. And it's not that they don't want to be inclusive. They just don't necessarily think about the fact that it might actually be a pretty well-kept secret that they're really interested in inclusion. So make sure that on any high holiday materials that go out, you have some sort of statement, not just like an inclusion mission statement or anything like that, but something really concrete about making the high holiday experience successful for everybody, regardless of ability. And again, really making sure there's a contact person, because it feels a bit disingenuous if you put the statement on there, but then there's not really anyone to talk to about what your needs are or what your child would benefit from. And I think you'll find, you know, maybe not in the next month, but as you start doing it and as you do it more and more for your temple as a whole, and then as high holidays come up again and again each year, I think what you'll find is that you'll start to get much more information from individuals and from families about what accommodations or modifications they or their children might need. Right now, people tend to be afraid to share because they just don't know what you're going to say in response. You have to remember that families of kids with special needs and individuals with disabilities themselves are told no on a regular basis. And so they oftentimes don't want to risk their spiritual home being one more place that they're told no. So they're not as likely to share that information. However, when temples and synagogues start to put that on their materials and start to really put that out there as a priority in this spiritual home, then you find that people start giving a lot more information. And that's where a lot more of your ideas are going to come from in terms of accommodations and modifications, beyond the visual schedules, beyond the social stories, beyond the multimodal ways of conducting a children's service. The best ideas are going to come from your congregants and from the people who really need those modifications to be made. Really don't underestimate the importance of good signage. This is so incredibly important, both because it provides visuals of what you want people to know, but also because the high holidays can be really overwhelming. You might be in a different space. You might be using rooms for things that are completely different from what you usually use them for. And the more that you can put up signs about what's happening where, but also signs about being an inclusive environment, ideals of your organization or synagogue or temple, the more that really creates an environment of inclusion as well. So this is just in general, right? It's not really specific to the high holidays, but I wanted to put it out there because I think, just like being Jewish shouldn't just be about attending the high holidays, inclusion shouldn't just be about the high holidays either. So these are 8 questions that I would love for you to take back to your organizations, to your synagogues, as you think about how to be more and more inclusive. I think you're going to have access to this later on. Joe can correct me during Q&A if I'm wrong. So I don't really want to go through and read it. So hopefully we'll find out and you'll have this afterwards. But these are important questions to ask yourselves as you plan for a more inclusive environment. These are my top 7 tips towards achieving inclusion. It was actually 6 as of this morning, and then I can't remember which one I added that I felt just had to be on here. But some of this is about people first, right? Seeing people first, not their disabilities, focusing on an ability, anticipating differences, which we've talked about a lot, right? It really needs to be proactive. You don't want families or children to show up and then have to be scrambling for how to best support them. Inclusion is a group effort. That comes back to the training piece and also the piece about clergy and congregants. Like I said, parents, caregivers, and the individuals themselves are usually your best resource. So as you start putting things out there about how you want to be inclusive, you're going to start to get information back. You really want to create, again, be proactive, and create opportunities for feedback. You really do want to be eliciting feedback from the people who are really affected by your inclusion efforts and by the congregation as a whole. How are you going to track how people feel about inclusion, how everybody's comfort level was, from various things, and how are you going to make sure that people are really comfortable to provide feedback so that you can become more and more inclusive. And that last thing, is that I really thought about a lot as I was preparing this webinar, is that there's really no secret to inclusion. There are a few of us who are doing this series of webinars who are sort of experts in the field because we do this work day in and day out. But it's really about having the right attitude. It's not about a particular program. It's about an attitude. It's about a belief system. It's about listening to all the people who are around you in your congregation, and thinking about those people that might be missing from your congregation, and thinking about, you know, what attitudes and behaviors are needed in order to get them in and help them feel welcome and successful. It's definitely a process. You might implement one tiny thing this high holiday season. You know, maybe it's going to be a fidget box in the back of the sanctuary, and that's one step. And you know, next year maybe you'll do two things, and throughout the year maybe you'll implement more ideas, and you know, think about how you can continue to build inclusion into the culture of your synagogue. And reach out to us. You can always contact Matan. We're always happy to help field questions. If you're looking for how to do a visual schedule, or you know, you're looking for visuals for a particular prayer, or you want to know more about how to do a social story, those, you know, are things that we do every day. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we're really, really happy to help your communities become more inclusive. If you're looking for ideas of creating your own social stories, I will recommend, or visual schedules, or anything visual, I'll recommend a couple of different websites that we really love to use. One is LessonPix, LESSONPIX.com. It's $36 for the whole year, and you can upload your own images, so you can actually have you know, a picture of your rabbi and a picture of your temple, and really create a social story that's very specific to your temple. I think it's pretty easy to use, and you can create anything on there. Once you upload pictures or do a search for pictures that are already there, you just click a button. You can make a social story, you can make a schedule, you can make a game. The possibilities are almost endless, and it's really fun. And the other one that we really recommend is Symbol Sticks, STYX, but the website is actually www.n, like Nancy, 2y.com. I think that one's about $75 a year, also not super expensive. There are a lot of Jewish symbols on there, people wearing a talit, for example, or a kippah, and it's a really cool site. If you don't know it, you should at least check it out. It's mostly like stick figure images that are very gender neutral, and just very, very clear cut for anybody really to look at. And again, you know, you can always check back to Matan's website for resources or materials. You can always reach out to us. And again, just the more proactive you can be, I think the more welcoming and successful everybody's going to feel at your high holidays. So thank you. I think we can take questions now.
All right. Thank you so much, Meredith, for that great presentation. We have a couple of questions that have come in so far from David Farbman and some others, more coming in, and that's great. That's exactly what we want. We're here to answer the questions. So I will turn it back over to Meredith in 1 second so she can officially kick off the Q&A session. I just wanted to give my answer for the first question. David Farbman asked if we had examples of synagogues that have put effective inclusion strategies in place. And on the Disabilities Inclusion Learning Center, and I'll type the link in the chat box in a minute, but on the Disabilities Inclusion Learning Center, we have exemplar congregations. And these are Reformed congregations from across North America who have shown to be exemplary in one or more areas of inclusion and facets of congregational life, and each exemplar has a contact person listed. And we've heard from many exemplars, many of the contact people, how much they enjoy being reached out to by other congregations and organizations looking for guidance. So definitely we recommend going there, and we are constantly updating the exemplar list. We have a new exemplar ready to go up this week even, so that's a great resource. And with that, I'm gonna mute myself and hand it back over to Meredith.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, and in addition, I would recommend a couple just that come to mind. I don't know where you're located and if you want to like go visit them, but the two that just popped into my mind, one is Temple Israel Center in White Plains, New York. They have a director of inclusion. Her name is Michelle Steinhardt. She also does a lot of work with Matan, so that's one person to reach out to, not a Reform temple though. And the other one is in St. Louis, Missouri, Shari Emeth. And the religious school director there, who's done a lot of work in inclusion, is Lisa Alperin. But you can also email me and I can put you in touch with people directly. The second question I see is, how can synagogues address hidden disabilities like difficulty with social skills and following social cues? So I actually think that most of what we talked about today actually is about hidden disabilities, because it can be much easier to address the needs of, let's say, a person in a wheelchair or a person with a walker or somebody who is clearly visually impaired. But I think it's the hidden disabilities that get really tricky, because we might have a tendency to sort of use discipline tactics for kids who are actually having difficulty, like you said, with social skills or following social cues. A lot of the visual stuff that we talked about can go a long way in helping with social skills and social cues. But again, the most useful thing is to know about in advance if there are children coming, and I can guarantee that there are, who struggle with social skills and following social cues, and building that into your program as well. And some of that really has to do with, really structuring the program. Kids with these challenges have the hardest time when they don't know what to expect, or when things are not really planned out. And so the best thing, again, that you can do is to be really proactive about that. The next question I see: on a Matan seminar last week, the term special needs was discouraged. You used it consistently today. Thoughts, suggestions, ideas about direction such reference is moving? Oh, I see. So it's a really, really good question. I think if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers. What I am finding is that adults with disabilities don't like the term special needs, but parents, and this is broad strokes, right? Lots of people will say, oh, but I know somebody, or I feel this way. This is broad strokes, but mostly the adults that I talk to who have disabilities prefer disabilities over special needs. Parents of kids with challenges or disabilities do seem to still be using the term special needs. I don't know what seminar in particular you're referring to, but I can think of some of our staff members and presenters who do tend not to use the term special needs. As an organization, we don't have like a firm policy about that, and people do what they're comfortable with. Interestingly, we talk so much about person first language, saying woman with autism, or, things like that. And we have somebody with autism on our staff, and she hates it. She says she'd much rather be called an autistic person. And I'm so ingrained to not do it that way. She actually laughs at me and says, it's not a curse word. You can say autistic, but that's just not what our training was. So in terms of ideas about the direction that this is moving, I think that people just are always going to have different opinions about it. And so I think the most important thing is like it's okay to ask, you know, if you're talking to a parent or you're talking to an individual and you're being really open about your desire to be inclusive, you can say like, hey, can I just ask, like, what do you prefer? So yeah, it's going to really depend. Thank you. You're welcome. My question relates to young adults with disabilities. Would you say that the suggestions you gave today regarding children with disabilities could be applied to older populations? For example, is designing a visual schedule or a social story appropriate for older groups? It's a great question. It definitely depends on the needs. Older individuals with communication disorders or autism or more significant special needs, I've definitely seen them using visual schedules and social stories. We put up a visual schedule before Passover of the Seder, and we heard back that it was used not so much by children, but by adults at the Seder with and without disabilities. The thing I really like for older individuals is symbol sticks. That's the N2Y.com website that I told you about, because it is much less juvenile. It deals with much more complicated topics than, say, like lesson picks would or anything like that. And I think it's I'm really glad you raised this question, because it's really important to be respectful of a person's age, whether they're nonverbal or developmentally delayed or anything, they still are their chronological age. And it is really important to take that into account and not to diminish their intelligence or their age in any way by creating things that are sort of, geared towards a much younger audience. But we've had really great success with symbol sticks for older individuals. And again, you'll see a couple of examples of that on our website. A lot of the images I used actually in this presentation were from symbol sticks. So hopefully that was helpful. Anonymous viewer asks, from a congregational perspective, inclusion can be expanded to increase sensitivity to sexual orientation, socioeconomic social status, race, adoptees, elderly, families that do not have any children. In your work, do you see the definition of inclusion expanding, or are you more oriented specifically to abilities or disabilities? It's a great question. In my work at Matan, when we talk about inclusion, it's really about special needs, because we are not expert in really any of those other things that you mentioned. But we do spend a lot of time talking to organizations that are experts in those things, because we recognize that that is all part of inclusion. So if you're gonna put a statement, let's say on your high holiday materials about inclusion, you can make it specific to disabilities, but you don't have to. You can make it, concise enough and also direct enough that people can come talk to you about really any of these things. But we are seeing sort of out in the world in general and in Jewish organizations in particular that, the word inclusion is very expansive and is being used for all of these different things. Which is actually a really good thing, because it advances all of our missions and also helps us work together. You're welcome. Any other questions, comments? I would also say, I don't know if this is possible, but usually people who participate in something like this have like a ton of their own ideas. So I don't know if there's any way for you all to connect with each other, but I know that those of you, in the field and doing this on the ground, have lots of success stories and lots of ideas.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. They will definitely be helpful once we post this and the questions and answers for everyone else who views this. And I know they were helpful for all of us watching. And in the meantime, I just want to thank Meredith again so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us today, and also really for making inclusion more accessible to all of us through the strategies you provided. And those strategies will be live along with this webinar. Thank you again, Meredith, and all of you for joining us.
Thank you so much.